This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Good superintendents can be hard to find and even harder to keep. That's proving to be the case in Boston, where the city is bracing for its third search for a new superintendent in just 8 years. Joining us today is James Vaznis. He's the longtime K-12 reporter for the Boston Globe. We're going to talk about the imminent departure of current superintendent Brenda Cassellius, the challenges facing the city's public education system, and how to cover superintendent searches effectively. Jamie, welcome back to WA Radio.
Thank you for having me.
For our listeners who may be unfamiliar with Boston Public Schools, give us a quick picture of some of the demographics.
Sure. The Boston Public Schools has 49,000 students. 85% of them identify as students of color. About 3/4 are low income. 30% are English learners, and 22% are students with disabilities.
Like many districts, Boston struggled through the pandemic to keep kids learning. What are the top challenges facing the district right now?
Helping students regain some of the time they lost learning during the pandemic is a huge challenge for the school system right now. And that just adds to a lot of pre-existing problems that the school district was grappling with before the pandemic. And some of those include just the overall deteriorating condition of the school buildings in Boston, 2/3 of which were built before World War II. And the school system really has built very few new school buildings since the 1970s. And they've also had, persistent problems bringing their English learner programs into compliance with federal law. There are lots of systemic problems with their special education programs, and they still struggle to get their school buses to school on time. And that's a problem that has been plaguing them now for more than a decade.
Like a lot of other urban districts, including places like Chicago, Los Angeles, Boston has seen its enrollment decline. I was really interested in a story that you wrote about Brighton High School and why that was an example of some of these broader challenges facing the city's school system. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. The state declared Brighton High School underperforming in 2016. It's a school that at one time had well over 1,000 students there, and enrollment recently dropped below 400 students, and it's bounced back a little bit, so it's over 400 now. But in a district where funding is allocated on a per-student basis that has really strict the amount of money the school has to provide programs. And at the same time, the school district is changing grade configurations and is shifting its secondary schools to a 7-12 structure. And so Brighton High, as it's trying to build a solid high school program, now has the additional challenge of creating a brand new middle school program.
It's interesting because over the years, I've seen districts try things like a K-8 model and parents really not being receptive to that and pushing back. What's been the response in Boston?
I think in Boston, for the most part, there appears to be more sort of appetite for K-8 schools. The elementary schools in Boston tend to be pretty popular, and so parents are very interested in extending their children's time in those schools as long as possible before they make decisions about where they want to send their children for high school or middle school. And so in Boston, there's a huge shift of students who go into the exam schools at grade 7, and that has led to some destabilization of the K-8 schools because there just simply often aren't enough students for grades 7 and 8. And then there's also a migration of students into charter schools in the middle grades.
Let's talk a little bit about Brenda Cassellius. She came from Minnesota. She became superintendent in the summer of 2019 to great fanfare. What was her big selling points when she was hired?
Superintendent, she had just a really sort of natural ability to connect well with families. And one of the big sort of goals that the school committee had when they hired her was trying to restore trust between the central offices and the individual schools and families and the greater community. And Dr. Cassellius is somebody who is very approachable and friendly, and and she seems to make very strong connections with many families. She had also spent an extensive amount of time in Minnesota as their state education commissioner, and she also seemed to have some skills in terms of being able to navigate complicated political landscapes.
There was, of course, the pandemic. How much of a wrench did that put into her plans for Boston?
Like many districts across the country, the pandemic really shifted priorities. There are things that Boston had to pursue or that Dr. Cassellius had to pursue that originally was not on her agenda. And, they suddenly had to completely change the way they were delivering education from something that was in a classroom to doing it entirely online. At the same time, they had to, prepare buildings to eventually educate students in person in pandemic conditions. And so there was almost every school building had to have significant modifications made for air quality and updating windows and other items like that.
I know from reading your stories and also stories by your colleagues on the Boston Globe's education team that the pandemic also peeled back the curtain on some significant gaps in how Boston was serving some of its neediest students, including special education students.
Right, literally hours before the mayor and the superintendent shut the schools down for the pandemic, the state had actually released its first review of the Boston public schools in a decade. And that review highlighted that there were just systemic problems in the running of their special education programs, and also documented massive problems with their English learner programs. And those are two student groups that were particularly hit hard by the pandemic. They had, aside from dealing with potential COVID cases in their families and the implications of that, a lot of these students had difficulties just accessing online learning. And so students who were already having difficulty getting services in a classroom setting oftentimes just weren't able to access education at all. And so it just created a greater urgency to reform these two departments.
We do want to say there were some bright spots during Dr. Cassellius' tenure. Can you talk a little bit about those, some places where she did gain some ground?
I think one of the most notable areas was her success in raising the standards for receiving a high school diploma. For years, other superintendents had struggled to gain support to adopt MassCore, which is something the state recommends. They're sort of a set of courses that reflect the admission requirements for the state universities. And Dr. Cassellius was able to convince the school committee to adopt these standards. I mean, it was a tough fight for her. There was initially a lot of resistance from many high school principals, but eventually she was able to build the support to get that passed.
Over the past 8 years, Boston has had 2 superintendents, 2 interim superintendents, and now it's going into its third formal search process in that many years. What's been the impact of that rapid turnover?
When you have that much turnover, it's just really hard to get reforms that stick. I mean, you'll have one administration take time to develop different curriculums or different shift in learning focuses, and then they announce their new initiatives, and then some of the initiatives don't even get implemented before they leave, or they're only partially implemented. I think the other thing, it just also creates a lot of turnover within senior administration in the central offices. And Just in the last 2 years, there's been several different individuals who have led the English learner office, the same with the special education department. So it's very difficult to get a system to move forward when there's just so much turnover in leadership.
When people talk about examples of why urban school districts really need stability at the top, they often point to a Boston example, and that would be Tom Pazan. He was considered a really successful superintendent, and he stayed for, 11 years?
Yes, that's correct.
Well, let's talk for a minute of the Boston School Committee. There are 7 members. They're appointed by the mayor. How much control do they really have over hiring and firing the city superintendent?
Technically, under state law, they're supposed to have full autonomy to hire and fire the superintendent. But in actuality, that just doesn't seem to be the case. The mayor, because she appoints the school committee, wields much power in influencing who the school committee hires as a superintendent. And in the case of the departure of these past 2 superintendents, it appears that the school committee was not fully engaged in the decision. In the instance of former superintendent Tommy Chang, he left after having a very tough conversation with then Mayor Marty Walsh, and the school committee was completely unaware he had decided to step down until media started asking about it. In the case of Dr. Cassellius, her decision to leave was announced on a Monday morning. She had a meeting that previous week with the mayor. The decision was announced jointly by the mayor and the superintendent and the school committee chair, but there had been no discussion up to that point on the school committee about changing superintendents. In fact, at the start of last summer, the school committee had decided to extend our contract by 2 years.
We're talking with Jamie Vaznis of the Boston Globe about the schools beat, superintendent searches, and more. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. Jamie, there's a push right now in Boston to return to an elected school board, and the public seems significantly in favor of this move, at least in a non-binding referendum. What are some of the pros that might happen here of going back to elected?
A lot of families and teachers and other advocates really believe having a school committee elected by the people will provide the community with more accountability in making sure that the school committee is making decisions that's in partnership with the community rather than perhaps making decisions that are perhaps dictated by the mayor.
Could this change complicate, though, the search for a new superintendent? I mean, how fast could they switch from an appointed to an elected board?
I think what they've been currently talking about, and all of this is just very much in the early stages of development, but there at least initially has been some discussion of possibly doing a phased approach to an elected school committee in which that, maybe a portion of members would continue to be appointed by the mayor, and eventually they would all become elected. Mayor Wu is actually more interested in a hybrid school committee in which that some members of the school committee would always be appointed by the mayor and others would be elected. But with all that, I think, with any new superintendent, they want to know who they're ultimately reporting to. And I do think this sort of question mark over sort of the future structure of the school committee could give some superintendents pause about coming here. I think the other thing that probably is weighing very heavily on a lot of people who are considering applying for the job is whether or not the district indeed would be taken over by the state.
That has loomed before, it's looming now. Is there any sense about how likely that is, or if it's really more just an overview at this point, that they're using that as a way to get into the district and just have the opportunity to take a closer look at how things are working?
Yeah, I think that kind of varies depending on who you're talking to. I mean, the Boston Teachers Union and Mayor Wu seem very concerned that the state will put the district into receivership. The BTU and the mayor testified before the State Board of Elementary and Secondary Education last week, urging them not to put the district into receivership. The state has not in any official way talked about putting Boston into receivership, although there are certainly some members of the state board that would like to see the state do that. But right now, the only kind of official word from the state is that they're doing a second review of the Boston Public Schools right now, just to gain a better sense of how much progress they have made over the last 2 years. What are the challenges they're continuing to struggle with? And what are some new challenges that have emerged since the last review?
Superintendent searches is one of the things I get asked about pretty frequently as EWA's public editor from new reporters who may be facing one for the first time. Let's talk a little bit about Boston's process. Is their search open or closed?
It's technically an open search with a portion of it that's closed. So right now, they have the school committee has appointed a search committee. Those meetings right now are public. They're holding a series of listening sessions with the community. Next week, the search committee will be making a recommendation on a search firm, and they will begin advertising the job. Obviously, the initial applications sent in will be kept private. Any interviews with the semifinalists will be private, but the finalists for the job, their names will become public, and they will do a public interview.
Superintendents are in hot demand right now. There are a lot of districts looking. Who is Boston competing against for this talent?
It kind of just varies. There are a few dozen districts right now looking for superintendents, but there's just a lot of fluidity right now. And so, there are some districts that have recently named new superintendents, such as in, Cincinnati, Seattle, and San Diego. But, other districts like Des Moines and Buffalo have recently announced superintendent departures. So, I think at the end of the day, in terms of who Boston's competing with, it really comes down to the individual candidate and, what other districts they may be weighing and just sort of any kind of geographic preferences they might have. So I think it gets pretty complicated when you get down to the individual candidates.
Once you get down to that individual candidate level and you have that short list in front of you, what's your next step? How do you go about looking into the candidates' backgrounds?
I think every reporter, when they get a list of finalists like that, their first instinct is going to be to go on Google and just sort of see what emerges immediately, whether that's news stories or other reports. I would also suggest just looking at the State Department of Education's for any district reviews in the districts those superintendent candidates are currently in. See if they've identified any issues, and then just reaching out to the various stakeholders in their current districts, teacher unions and parents and students, principals, education advocates, and nonprofits.
A friendly phone call to the local reporter currently covering that candidate's district is also a good call.
Yes, that can be helpful.
Are there any stories that you would recommend reporters be tackling right now for just the K-12 school speed? Is there a story you'd like to see other reporters in other cities that you're particularly proud of for the Globe that you'd like to see people follow?
I think as we're getting out of the pandemic, I think just trying to get back into the classrooms and school buildings as much as possible, and just trying to just sort of document what life is like in this post-pandemic era is critically important.
I think that's a great suggestion, and the more we can get back into those schools is going to be terrific. Of course, it's going to require some cooperation on the part of the districts.
Right, exactly.
Are there any misconceptions people might have about Boston schools? I mean, you've been covering them since 2008. You know them well, and you've been with the Globe since 2002. I think a lot of people, when they think of Boston, the first thing that might come to mind are those exam schools that you talked about, but that's a small slice of it.
Yes, I think about a third of high school students go to the exam schools, or maybe like a quarter, but it's a significant number of students. I guess one of the things is I think there's a notion that the schools have a lot of money because the city has an enormous tax base of $176 billion, and the school system does operate on a budget of $1.3 billion. But when you get into the schools, it's really striking just how little of that money seems to be making its way to the students and teachers in the classroom, and they're short on basic supplies and materials and books and updated computers, and teachers are crowdfunding for some of these things, and just just a lot of the school buildings are just so old that they lack really basic things like potable water and dedicated spaces for the arts and gym and science, library, and even a cafeteria.
So the next superintendent has a lot of work ahead.
Yes, the person does.
Well, I'm looking forward to following your coverage of that search. Thank you so much, Jamie, for making time for EWA Radio.
You're welcome. Thank you.
James Vaznis joined the Boston Globe in 2002 and covers K-12 public education. He also writes for The Great Divide, the newspaper's special team, looking at issues related to educational equity. That wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.